So by getting obsessed with it and just reviewing the numbers over and over and over again and trying to figure out a process, I was able to get to that point where I had a process that ensured I wasn't going to make a mistake, okay? And so today what I'm going to try and do is walk you through that entire process so you guys understand how to not make a mistake also. Because I've built a business around ensuring that nobody buys an unprofitable Airbnb again. And the reason I've built my business around that is because I know it's possible to not buy a bad property if you just do enough homework before you actually get the property. So that's why we're going to be talking about how to get it right from the start, right? Ensuring that you're not buying a bad property right from the get-go. Now, I tend to talk pretty quick, and I'm going to talk pretty quick again. And I'm going to be going through a lot here. So I'm going to be covering a few different processes that I do, and I'm going to try and talk about them at a very high level so that it becomes very easy to see the entire process all the way through. Now, there's going to be a ton of detail that I'm not going to cover, but if you can just understand this process and this flow, that if you go through it, you end up with the right answer. That's what I want you guys to understand, right? And then once you've seen this, you can go to my website. I've got it all listed out over a 40-hour course that teaches you every single last step that I use to be able to find the 180 plus properties, right? So the issue is that people are acquiring properties that are never going to cash flow. Every single property can be pretty, okay? So all the beautiful properties that you see on Airbnb or the ones that I like to post on my Instagram, every single property can look like that, right? But not every single property can cash flow. And that's one of the main things that I want to try and solve with this presentation and just in general with my business. I've already told you about me. I've told you about what I did with TechFester, which was identifying the most profitable markets, what's the absolute best thing to buy within that market, and how do we maximize the revenue out of that property. So that's the process we're going to be walking through today. But the proof of the success is not only the fact that we're 100%, every single last property is cash flow positive. Also, when I had to make the predictions of how much these properties were actually going to end up making, I was accurate within 25%. So I always like to predict for the downside, the worst case scenario, right? And then we try to hit the best case scenario. So with the majority of my predictions of how much these properties are going to make before we actually get them, if I were to say they're going to make 100,000, they actually end up making 125,000, which is exactly where we want to be, right? Now, mind you, that's an average. It's kind of all over the place, but it's an average, right? And I explain my logic here because guys want you to understand that I'm not a data analyst or a data scientist. I do not have a formal background in data analytics. If I talk to somebody who is actually a data analyst, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so this here is the logic that I have used and then just tried to simplify this process as much as I possibly can. And it's a simple logic of the Burger King logic. So McDonald's spends millions of dollars to figure out what corner to be on, and Burger King opens up across the street with the same product, right? And all we're doing is we're using the millions of Airbnbs that currently exist, and we're studying them, and we're trying to figure out exactly what people are doing that's allowing them to win, and then we're replicating it. And that's it. There's nothing else more complicated to this process, okay? So the main problem that we're actually going to be solving here, I know I kind of talked, we want to make sure it's cash flowing, but the main problem is that people study properties, not markets. And it's actually in the reverse of what you should be doing. So the scenario that that I hear all the time is that somebody decides that they're going to get an Airbnb, and they've saved up $100,000, and they're like, I'm going to go get an Airbnb. And then they go to their lender and they ask them, how much am I approved for? And they say, you're approved for 500,000. They go, okay, cool. I'm approved for 500,000, and I like this market, or heard this market is going to be pretty good. Which home here sells for $500,000? And then they decide that that's a property that they're going to kind of move forward with. I'm simplifying it a ton, but that tends to be around the case of how some people go about it. And the problem is that property that they're looking at, they don't know if that is the best possible property to purchase within the market that they're going into. They don't even know if that's the best possible market for them to be in the first place, right? And so the idea here is that you want to study the market, know the market like the back of your hand, and then from there, be able to know that the property that you're going to get within that market is going to be the most optimal property to get to drive the most amount of revenue, okay? So that's what we're going to go through today. The five main steps to getting it right from the start. We're going to go through picking out the right market for you, building out a buy box, hunting for the property, doing a property evaluation, and then underwriting those properties, okay? The first two, I'm going to spend a whole whack load of time on. The majority of presentation is going to be the first two. The last three, we're going to kind of skip through. So picking out the right market for you. You may be in a situation where you're not trying to pick out the next market, but you're going to come to a time where you are going to have to pick out another market if you're going to continue to expand your business, right? And this is the process that I've used. So when I had to go figure out what markets TechFester was going to be in, I went through over 300 plus markets over a 6-month period. And I went market by market by market to try to find the markets that had the best possible potential, so that I knew that the market that I was putting them into was one of the best across the entire country. And when I say one of the best, it's mainly based off of how well it will cash flow, as long as everything else is true, such as like good regulations and it's a good place to buy real estate, right? The reason I hyper focus on the cash flow is because if your property doesn't cash flow and we hit a recession and then you're losing money for the next 2 years, you're going to be forced to sell, and that's the worst possible scenario. So therefore, if your property cash flows a decent amount, that gives you this really nice cushion of protection to ensure that you can keep making it work and you don't have to sell the property in the worst case scenario. And then you can get through the recession, and then you get to the boom, which is right after the recession. I have a bit of a financial background as well. That's why I always think in those terms, right? So anyways, back to markets, right? The reason what we're going to do here is we're going to understand how to go through all the different markets. And what we're going to do is create a short list, okay? Because to truly understand a market like the back of your hand, it's going to take a long time of studying it. If I were to study Austin, Texas right now, and I've actually tried studying Austin a couple of times, it takes me anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to actually go through all of Austin to feel extraordinarily confident to know what is the most optimal thing to purchase in Austin, right? And so that's a massive, massive market. And if you're going to go into any market, it's going to take some amount of time to actually study it and really know it like the back of your hand. So then therefore, we can't study all of them that in depth. So we have to create a short list of a handful of markets that you really care about, that you think are going to be good, and that you want to know. And so this is my process for finding a short list of markets that you can actually deep dive. Step one is, what's the best market for you? Okay. So the idea here is, if you like beach markets, then just study all the different beach markets and try to find the best one, right? If you like mountain markets, do the same idea. And the reason I say that is because you should give a shit about your listing, right? If you don't care about the market and you're never going to go there and don't want to fly out there or anything along those lines, you're going to put less effort into that property, and you're going to see a downward effect from that. And so then therefore, care about the property, actually want to go visit it once a year, something along those lines. And that means you got to pick a place you actually want to go to, right? The next one is your budget, which is super straightforward. If you can only afford a $300,000 home, there's going to be a bunch of markets that you can't enter, right? Unless you're buying a condo, but that's a whole other scenario. And then regulations. With regulations, you want to pick a market that has regulations already in place. That's my strategy. And they have put favorable regulations towards Airbnb. So they allow you to Airbnb in some sort of way. I will never enter a market where they don't allow it. I don't think anyone here would, right? But then there's the opposite idea of going into a market where there's no regulations. And that one scares just the shit out of me, because if they came in with regulations, they could wipe all those Airbnbs out, which they have done in a ton of different markets. Now, at this point, most markets do have regulations in place in one way or another. So there's very few places that no longer don't have regulations yet, right? So anyways, pick a market, has regulations. If you just follow those first 3 steps right there, that's going to narrow down so many markets that you're going to get to, again, like a significantly shorter list in comparison to the thousands of markets that you could be looking into across America, or the world in that case, right? And now step 4 and 5 and 6, we're going to go into a little bit more detail. I'm going to say this right now. The step 4 and step 5, I have always struggled to properly explain it very clearly. So deal with me as I kind of work through it, right? But I'm going to do my best to make sure it makes a ton of sense. And 4 and 5 are connected, and then the saturation is another one altogether. So step 4 is the 20% rule. This has been my general rule of thumb that I've used to look at a property and into a market to feel extremely confident that the property is going to cash flow at an amount that I'm going to be happy with, okay? So what I'm trying to say here, first off, let me explain the rule. The 20% rule says that if I'm going to buy a home for $500,000, it should make $100,000 at a minimum. And if it does, then I will be happy with the amount of cash flow that comes from that. Now, if it made the 15% rule, right, and made $75,000, it would still cash flow, but I'm not going to be as happy, right? So I want to find a property that has the ability to meet that 20% rule. The higher you can get that percentage, the more profitable it's going to be, okay? The price to rent ratio. So that's the first step. Now, what you're doing in this step is you're trying to look into a market from a very high level and trying to determine if that market has the potential to meet the 20% rule. Now, we're not deep diving the market. We're just quickly looking into it and saying, if I were to guess quickly, can I see that ratio exists? And so what you would do is you would go to AirDNA and you'd type in the market that you're curious about, right? And then you would narrow down the properties that you want to look at. You want to try and narrow it down as much as you can to get a good feel for this. So I'm going to use Scottsdale as an example here. Let's say that you're looking into Scottsdale, but you decide to look into the downtown of Scottsdale. And you know you want to buy a single family home, and most single family homes are 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, or 5 bedrooms. So then therefore you just focus in on the 4 bedrooms, right? And so now you're just looking in one spot in Scottsdale, you're just looking at the 4 bedrooms, and then you also remove the bad data, which we'll get into. And so now you've narrowed it down, okay? And at this point, you have a lot less data that you're working with. And then what you want to do is you want to try and find this trend. So you want to find some sort of consistency in the numbers. And so never use the top 1%. That's how you're going to make a huge mistake. If you look at the top 5 properties and you're like, I'm definitely going to be able to outperform this one no matter what, that's usually how you shoot yourself in the foot before you get started, right? Expecting that you're going to be the best of the best, especially in an extremely competitive market. And so instead, what I try to do is I try to go down to the average, where like I'm starting to see that there's 10 homes, 20 homes that are all doing roughly between 100 and 120 or whatever it may be, right? I can just see a lot of consistency. And then at that point, I'm going to look at those properties and I'm going to understand the bones of those properties. So the frame, the size of it, the size of the backyard, the stuff that is not added to the property, right? And I'm going to get a general understanding of what those properties look like that are roughly making between 100 and 120,000 in this specific spot in Scottsdale, and what the what they look like, okay? And so once I have that understanding, I can then hop over to Zillow, and I can go to Zillow and see on Zillow, do those properties exist at a price point that will meet the 20% rule? So if I were then to go into Zillow and find a bunch of 4 bedrooms in the downtown of Scottsdale that had the same sized property and they were selling for 500,000 to 600,000, I would go, that meets the 20% rule, right? That's at a high level. I'm looking in, I'm just doing this quickly, and I go, okay, this market might have the potential to meet that 20% rule, right? And what I would do at this point is I would sort of add this market to my short list. I would say, okay, this market might have the potential to have a lot of cash flowing properties if I were to deep dive that market. And the reason why I love doing this 20% rule at a really high level is because what you're going to find out the vast majority of the time is when you go to look in for that 20% rule at the high level, you're almost never going to find it. You're going to find it'll be like a 12% price rent ratio or a 15% price rent ratio. And what this is telling you is that market doesn't have the ability to hit that 20% price rent ratio unless you were to like super deep dive and buy an undervalued property or an off-market property. It's going to be a lot harder is what I'm trying to say. Now, keep in mind, when I'm doing all this research, I was doing it for TechVestor, and TechVestor tries to buy a lot of properties in one market. And so then therefore, if you're only looking to buy 1 or 2 and you can wait out for a good deal or try to create a good deal, then that makes it a little bit different, okay? And you can maybe find a market that has that 15% price rent ratio and make it into a 20% price rent ratio. Going a little bit deep on that, if you want to ask me more questions about that afterwards, feel free to come up and ask me that question. But the general idea here, guys, is that you have narrowed down the short list of markets that you want to go into based off of the first few steps here, 1, 2, 3. Now you're with these markets that you want to look into, you're very high level trying to figure out if they can meet that 20% rule, okay? And if they do, you add it to your short list. And those are the markets that you're likely going to deep dive even further, okay? And if you do this I did this across a lot of markets. I think I did this process here 170 times, and I would rank them, give them like a ranking out of 10, so 0 to 10. And if it looked like there was very clearly properties that were hitting the 20% rule, even without doing the deep research, I would give it a 10%, a 10 out of 10 ranking, knowing that if I had to deep dive this, I'm going to find a lot of cash flow, right? Whereas sometimes you see like that 15% rule, it's like maybe if I dived a lot deeper, I could actually figure it out. Anyways, you get the idea. It creates a short list and you get a lot closer, and you just want to make sure that there's inventory on Zillow that matches up with that. The last thing here you want to do when it comes to looking into these markets, I actually don't think you need to do this. I just want to state this. When I built out this presentation originally, I thought that, you need to do this. I think nowadays you really don't need to, but it's good to know this before you actually enter into the market. Is the market saturated or not? Now, I can make an entire presentation on this because there's a lot of ways to think about this. Jeremy and I talked about it for probably a good 10 minutes yesterday on the podcast. But the general rule of thumb here is using AirDNA, you can see how much the supply has increased year over year. You can see how much the revenue has increased year over year. And so if the supply has gone up by 10% and the revenue has gone up by 10%, that means each individual listing is roughly making the exact same year over year, right? Because it turned out that that market needed more supply to meet the demand. But then if you have the supply jump up by 20% and the revenue doesn't change at all, then each of those individual listings are starting to make less money, okay? Now, again, there's nuances to this. You could, there's you know, the 5 bedrooms in a market, are the 5 bedrooms saturated compared to the 1 bedrooms, right? And then you can go deeper and deeper into that. So don't stress too much about this. I think way too many people have made it like this thing that all of the markets are saturated, and they're not, okay? Especially if you know what you're doing. So with that being said, we've covered the very first process here, which is be in a place that you want to visit, be within a budget that you can actually afford, have favorable regulations in place, make sure that you can meet the 20% rule with the inventory that's available on the market, and make sure that's not oversaturated. And if you can do this, this is a market that you should then build a buy box for, okay? Because you like the market, you know it can work for you. And so now what you need to do is get to the next step, which is building out a buy box. Now, I believe that buy boxes are the superpower within this industry. And within real estate, whatever it may be, if you can build a buy box, you are going to be so much far ahead of anybody else within the market that you're going to be going into, because you're going to understand it extraordinarily well. So buy boxes have been my superpower, but anybody can build out a buy box and it'd work out amazing for you. For anyone who doesn't understand what a buy box is, it is just simply knowing exactly what to buy within the market that you're looking into, specifically where, okay? I'm going to give a quick example of a buy box. This is an actual buy box, so I'm not giving out the market. So there's just a specific market that we're in and an area within that market that if we were to buy a 4-bedroom home that was ideally under 400,000, but even if it was under 500,000, that would be okay too. But it would need to have high ceilings with an additional loft that can be converted to a 5th bedroom with an additional living room that could be large enough to fit more than just a pool table in there. And it also needs to be able to have a dining room that can sit at least 10 people. And there needs to be a deck. The bigger the deck, the more money we'll end up making. But as long as it's a decent sized deck that we can actually fit some seating up there. And then there needs to be a flat ground as well. And if it's a cabin-ish feeling looking place, that's great. And if you get a fence around the entire property, that's a huge bonus. And so if we were to find a property that looked like that, we're buying it instantly. We're not waiting whatsoever. If it shows up on the market, we'll put an offer in that day if we have the money for it, right? Because we know that that property cash flows every single time if we were to buy it. So that's an example of a buy box, and why a buy box is a superpower, because everything I just explained there is a revenue driver for that market. Now, will every single property we buy in that market meet 100% of that buy box criteria? Likely not, right? But if we can get 80% of those things in there, we can make it work. And so that's the idea of a buy box. And so this is how I create buy boxes. The first step is that you want to pinpoint the most profitable area, and then you want to clean and review the data, and then you want to determine which features drive revenue, and then you want to bring it all together for that buy box, okay? So pinpointing the most profitable area is quite literally repeating the 20% rule over and over and over again at a deeper level. So just like I was saying, hey, let's look into Scottsdale and let's take a look at those 4 bedrooms within that specific area and see if they meet the 20% rule. Well, you're going to repeat that, but then you're also going to do it again for the 3 bedrooms and the 5 bedrooms in a different area of Scottsdale. And you're going to do it again for the 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms. And you're going to kind of keep doing this until you find the best price to rent ratio. And so you'll make a note. You'll go to 4 bedrooms within downtown Scottsdale, meet the 18% rule. I think I can comfortably say they'll be around that 18% rule. But if you keep doing it, you realize that the 5 bedrooms in the North Scottsdale area potentially meet the 20% price to rent ratio. But then the 3 bedrooms in a different area actually meet 25% price to rent ratio. And so if you continue to do this, you'll realize that there's certain areas and certain parts of the market and certain sizes of the homes that are going to have a better price to rent ratio, okay? And then the idea here is that when you have a good understanding of where the most money is being made within a market, that's when you want to deep dive it even further. And the one example I want to give here is that in Scottsdale, there's a place called Paradise Valley where people make hundreds of thousands of dollars off of their Airbnbs, but the properties cost millions and millions of dollars, right? So the property could be making $400,000, but it costs $10 million for that home. And so then therefore there's no cash flow. So it's not profitable, right? And so the idea is that how do we find the places with the most profit? It doesn't just have to be the most expensive home. It's just where the best price to rent ratio is. The higher that ratio, the more cash flow you're going to have, right? So repeat that process until you figure it out, and then we're actually going to get to work, okay? So this is where the deep process of understanding this market really comes into play. You're going to make sure you're cleaning all of your data. I'm not going to talk about good versus bad data on this. Go onto YouTube. There's a bunch of videos that talk about this, but it's very important to make sure you're working with only good data, okay? With that being said, once you've figured out that 3 bedrooms within this specific area of Scottsdale have the best price to rent ratio, and you want to understand that portion extraordinarily well, you would make sure you have all the good data, and then you're going to make notes on every single last one of those properties one after another. And the notes that I like to make are all the ones that you see right here, right? So I am trying to look at everything. I'm trying to see the quality of the home. Is it a luxury home, a regular home? Is it a unique home? What do the Airbnb photos look like? Do they have a design, or is it just furniture in there? What kind of amenities do they have? Do they have any sort of like differentiating factor about their property? And I'm writing all of this stuff down. Like, what color is the kitchen? What color is the bathroom? How high are the ceilings? Do the ceilings have wood beams on them? How big is the living room? How big is the dining room? You can determine that by how big the couches are in those areas. How many living rooms do they have? And I'm trying to make a note on everything that I'm seeing, because I'm telling you right now, you guys probably look at these listings and you kind of scroll through them and you're like, okay, I can kind of get it all. But when you start writing it down, it changes everything, because you're not missing anything as you're going through this, okay? Now, I've been trying to simplify my process as much as I possibly can to just make it very straightforward, because I feel like I overcomplicate things sometimes when they don't need to be. This is all I'm doing. This is the game that I'm playing all day, every day, is I'm just trying to spot the difference, right? I'm quite literally looking at Airbnb photos and trying to spot the difference between the people that are making a lot of money and the people that are not making a lot of money. And I'm just trying to see what's the difference. This actually was one of my favorite games to play as a kid. And it's funny that now this is what I do as a molder. But if I were to go through here, okay, so if you guys can see this top performer here is making $199,000 a year. The lowest person is making $118,000. The easiest way to understand this is that if you can understand why this one's making $199 and why this one's making $118. So this property has something that this property does not have. And if you can understand what it is that this one has, you will then know what the revenue drivers are for that market. And then you're just adding up what the revenue drivers are, okay? Because these are the same sized homes. They all have 4 bedrooms. They all have a kitchen. They all have a bathroom. They all have a living room. But there's something that this one has that the other one doesn't. And it's not about a factor of being luxury. Is what is it like? Remove any home that's luxurious, okay? Just get rid of it completely and try to find the home that's a regular home matched up against another regular home that has things that the other one does not, that's allowing it to significantly outperform. And then it's as simple as that. That is the revenue driver, okay? So then therefore, if you add that to your property, you'll do better than 118. You might even do better than 125, right? And so at this point, once you've made all of your notes and you understand everything and you've been able to spot the difference, then you just bring it all together. You go, in the backyard, I need X, Y, and Z, because the top performers had that, but the underperformers did not have that. And so then therefore, if I have that, I'll be a top performer and I'll be able to outdrive everybody's revenue. And then you do it for the interior. What do they have in the interior that allowed them to do it, right? Where were they located? Where the majority of these people located in one spot, or were they kind of scattered all over the place? They're all generally located in one area. It goes, okay, I need to be there, and I need to have a white kitchen, and I need to have a pool, and I need to have a large enough backyard to be able to put a pickleball court in there, and I need to use this sort of a design. And if I can do all of these things and bring it all together, I will be competitive with the top performing property. Therefore, I should be able to offer a similar product as them, and people will be willing to pay a similar price as them. And then therefore, I should logically make roughly around the same amount as them, right? And so that is quite literally it. That's how a buy box is understanding what the revenue drivers are for a market outside of the bedroom, bathroom, dining room, and whatnot, okay? And you just summarize it all together. And then from there, you just bring everything together and your buy box is done. So you bring all your data. This is how I like to build mine. You can build it however you want, but I have all my data down below. I have all the summarized information about the interior, the exterior, the location, whatnot up top. I have some of the photos of like the top performing properties, what they look like on the inside and the outside to make sure I know exactly what I'm looking for. I've got all my data plotted on a map so I know where to go, where not to go, stuff like that, right? That is a buy box. And with this, it is truly the best superpower you can have for a market, okay? So that is the process. Pinpoint the most profitable area, look for that best price to rent ratio, clean and review the data, make notes on every single last thing as you're seeing them, as you're going through, determine which features are actually driving revenue for you, and then bring it all together to create that buy box, okay? The bonus is like, make sure you talk to a local if you're not from there, Okay, this is actually something that I used to not do for quite a while. But if I'm not from there, I'm 100% calling usually a property management company. Some of you property management companies would not like that. But I would call up Patrick and be like, hey, Patrick, I'm getting a property there. Can you tell me, how do I drive revenue here? Like, what are some things that I should know about this? Because Patrick is going to be incentivized to let me know because I might use his business, right? And so he wants to make me a customer. I might use his business. I might not use his business, but I'm going to get all that local information about that area that I should know. Like one of my favorite ones that I ever got was in this one market, this lady who had a whole bunch of properties told me, she's like, if you have a ramp for wheelchairs, you'll be able to book way more homes. So if you make your property wheelchair accessible, because there was like 4 generations of families that went to this one market, and apparently there was a lot of wheelchairs. And so that would help you be able to boost your revenue, get more bookings, things along those lines. The data did not show any of that, right? But that lady told me that, and it made a huge difference to the buy box that I was building out, okay? So always talk to a local. So we have covered 2 steps. So we've been going for quite a while now. We've covered 2 steps, right? We picking out the right market for yourself and building out a buy box. Now these last 3 steps, like I said, I'm going to go through them a little bit quicker. Once you have a buy box, hunting for a property becomes a ton of fun because you know exactly what to look for and what to avoid, right? But what you would do is you would go on to Zillow and you would add in all these filters, all the filters that they allow you to add in. So this is, Fairbanks, Alaska, and what you can see is that I only circled a certain part of it, like the top left part, but I didn't touch the bottom right. And that was because nobody was making money on the bottom right. Therefore, I would never buy a property in the bottom right in this scenario, right? I've never been to Fairbanks. I don't know Fairbanks, but I'm assuming that that's the place where people kind of want to stay, right? Maybe it has better properties, maybe it has better land, has better views, whatever it may be. But I also knew that I couldn't buy a property over 600,000. I needed to be over 3 bedrooms. I know I needed to be a home, and there's a couple other filters that I don't recall that are also in there as well, right? And so I can add all that into Zillow. I can click Save Search, and then I can ask it to give me an email reminder every single time a new property pops up on the market that meets that criteria. But the problem here is that all these properties are vastly different. And so now what you do is you understand all the revenue drivers within that market. And so then you just try to find the property that has 100% of your revenue drivers, because that's a property that's going to be able to hit the highest possible revenue and try to get it at the lowest possible price. So which property has the most revenue drivers at the lowest possible price? That's the property I want. And if I have 50 properties that I got to go through, I'm going to review all of them to be able to try and figure out which one is the best out of all of them, right? Now, obviously some markets are going to have significantly less, but that's the idea. And that's the process that you want to do, is you want to find the property with the most revenue drivers for the lowest price. And so you just repeat that process over and over again. You can call up your realtor and ask them to create those filters as well, but you're just reviewing the properties over and over and over again. Okay. And then once you've done that and you found, maybe there was 50 properties, but you realize like there's 5 of them that are your best possible chance. The next thing you need to do before you can get to the underwriting is truly understand the revenue potential of the property. So a property evaluation, this really should be called a revenue estimator. Okay. Do not use AirDNA's revenue estimator or anybody else's revenue estimator when it comes to this point. Make sure you go through these listings one by one in this simple process I'm going to show you right now. Okay. But once you think about this for a second, guys, right? We studied the markets. We studied we studied which market to go into, then we studied that market like crazy. We feel like we built out a buy box. We understand it completely. And now we're going to deep dive again an individual property. It's like, why do we need to deep dive it so much if we already built out a buy box? And it's because we don't want to miss anything. I'm going to tell a quick little story here because I think it's a huge mistake that I saw. I met this guy. He bought a property in a market that I know extremely well. It's a mountain market. So you would think a mountain market, the most important thing is a hot tub and a fire pit, right? Because most mountain markets, that's how it goes. However, this was a 4-season resort market. And so it's hyper-focused around families. And so then therefore, the number one revenue driver for this market was actually game rooms, because during the winter, they needed a place for the kids to go and have a fun time. And for whatever reason, that drove way more revenue. So we knew that we wanted to throw more money at the game room than anything else. And then this guy shows me his property that he got in this area. And it was one of this typical, like, looks good. It was a cool looking property, had no game room, right? He did not buy a property that has a second living room and able to add in that game room. And so then therefore, he's miles behind everybody already. Maybe he has a bit of a cool factor, but the parents that are booking these properties are going to see the other properties with the game room, so that after they go snowboarding all day, they can go sit on the couch upstairs in the living room and send the kids to the game room and take a breath, right? So then therefore, that was a huge mistake this guy made, because maybe he didn't understand his buy box, right? But at the same time, maybe he didn't deep dive the property enough to just understand that, hey, this property doesn't have a second living room. I've studied so many properties. You wouldn't believe how easy it is to miss the fact that it doesn't have a second living room, especially with the way that some of these photos are taken. And so It's an important thing to really deep dive the property and truly understand it before you move forward with it. And I'm going to try and explain this once again in the simplest possible way to understand it. What you want to do is you want to find all the properties that are the most comparable to the property that you're considering to purchase, all the ones that currently exist. And you want to, I put them into a spreadsheet and I stack them up from who's making the most to who's making the least, okay? The reason I do this, it makes it very easy to understand why one property would be making more than the other as you're going through them. It logically will always make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, it's usually bad data, okay? But in this scenario, we have a whole bunch of 2 bedrooms. One's making 140, or the top one's making 140, the bottom one's making 65. That's a huge variance, right? They're all the same area, they're all the same size, but for some reason, there's a huge difference. Now, if I had a property within this market that I was considering to purchase, I would stack these all up, and then I'd go to this one that's making 140, and I would open it up, and I would try to ask myself, can the property that I'm considering to purchase beat this property or not? That's it. Can I beat it or not, right? And there are some properties that you cannot beat. So as an example, say I was about to buy a property and in the backyard it had a pool and some additional room, but not a ton of additional room, right? Just kind of like there was a little bit of room around the pool. Maybe I could add a fire pit. And then I go and look at this property. It's doing 140,000 and it's got half an acre and it's got a pickleball court. It's got a volleyball court. It's got putting green. It's got all of these things in the backyard. Plus it also has the 4 bedrooms and all that other stuff that I have too. I'm never going to be able to beat that home. Ooh, I almost fell off. I'm never going to be able to beat that home ever, right? Because it has so much more value in comparison to what I have. And you guys always keep in mind that a Airbnb room is a product, even though it doesn't feel like a product. You would never pay more for a Civic in comparison to a Rolls Royce, right? And so your Airbnb is the same idea. When somebody's paying for something, they use that same logic in their head. And so then therefore, if this property making $140,000 is bigger, better, more luxurious, I'm not going to be able to make $140,000. That's the simplest and easiest logic ever, right? So then repeat that again. Go to the ones doing 120 and ask yourself, can I beat that property or not? And you just simply say yes or no. And you continue this all the way down, right? And then where this becomes a superpower is where you run into a property that you know for a fact you are going to be able to beat because maybe your property is bigger, better, and more luxurious in comparison to that one. And you have something about your property that's going to be able to dominate their property. And when you get to those properties where you look at them and you know for a fact you're going to be able to outperform them, that's where you get all the confidence in the world. That's where I've gotten all of my confidence in the world is from the underperformers, where I look at them and go, okay, well, at a minimum, we're going to make more than X. So as an example here, right? We have one property doing 140. And let's say I know for a fact I'm not going to be able to beat that. Then we have a couple here that are doing around 120. And I look at those two and I go, I don't think we can beat them, but I'm not as confident as the 140. Then we get to these next ones and they're doing between 112 and 100,000. And maybe I look at all 3 of them and I genuinely have no idea if I will do better or worse. I'm kind of confused. I'm conflicted when I look at them, right? Those are sort of your middle of the pack ones where maybe we'll see. But then I get down to these 2 that are doing 79 and 77. And I look at both of those and I know without a doubt I'm going to beat them. My property is bigger. I can make mine better. Maybe they didn't do a great job putting it together. Maybe I can add more amenities in them. Whatever it is, I know I can beat them. That's easy, okay? So what ends up happening here is I now have a range between my base comp and my top comp. So I know that at a minimum, I'll do over 80,000, but I probably won't make more than 120. And so now I have this $40,000 range for this property that I'm sitting in. And now it's my job to use these other comps to figure out where I'm going to fall within that range. Am I going to land at 90,000 or 110,000, right? And that's the idea that you want to be able to hit there. And that is it, okay? When it comes to property valuations, you find the most comparable properties. You say, is my property going to beat this property? Yes or no. You find your base, you find your top, you get your range, and then you figure out where you're going to fall within that range, okay? This process here, I can explain for days. There's a ton of nuances to it. It is the thickest part of my entire course, but I'm trying to explain it in the simplest possible form, okay? So, hope that makes sense. But once we figure this out, you now have your annual revenue. And when you have your annual revenue, we can finally do the last stage here, which is underwriting, right? So you can't do your underwriting unless you know what the property is going to actually end up making. And underwriting, I'm not going to teach underwriting whatsoever because that is a lot to teach. But in general, when you're underwriting a property, you're just simply trying to understand what your cash on cash is going to be or what your cash flow is going to be for the most part, right? And so instead of teaching this, I'm just going to give my general advice. And that is to underwrite as many properties as you possibly can within the market that you're looking into. So if we followed this entire process and we figured out the best market to be in, and then we figured out what was the absolute best thing to buy within that market, and then we built out our buy box, and then we found a handful of properties that we thought were actually going to be worthy of what we're purchasing. And then we actually analyze those properties to figure out what the revenue potential is of them. And then if we underwrite all of them, what's going to end up happening is if you underwrite each one of these ones, say you underwrite like 10 or 15 or 20, you are going to find a trend. You're going to find a common number that shows up over and over again. And then once you realize what the average return is for that market, when you find the outlier, that's when you can pull the trigger in a second. When you find you realize that all these properties are making 10%, and then you realize that this one that has all of your revenue drivers that you know is at a great purchase price, and for whatever reason, this one allows you to be able to make 20%. This does exist, okay, I promise you. You realize that that's your outlier, and that's a property you should move forward with. And it becomes really, really easy to feel confident with making that decision because you know it's the best possible property within that market that's going to drive the most amount of revenue, right? So that's the entire process, guys, from end to end. We picked out the market, we built out the buy box, we hunted for the property, did the evaluation, and then we did the underwriting. Jeremy, do I have a couple extra minutes? Well, I got one more thing I actually want to cover if I had enough time, and then we'll do Q&A. Okay, cool. So the last thing I want to just talk about here is amenities. Amenities are everything now, right? So there's the term going around, the amenities arms race. That's what everyone's referring it to. So I want to talk a little bit about how to think about investing into amenities. Airbnbs have set expenses for the most part, right? So the mortgage is not going to change. The insurance is really not going to change for the most part, right? If you're down in Florida, maybe you're getting increases, but for the most part, your electricity bill, it'll fluctuate a little bit depending on how much people are using it. But for the most part, you know, an Airbnb is going to have set expenses. And the idea is try to make more than your set expenses, right? Naturally. And so if I had a property that had $80,000 in set expenses, if I can make $100,000, I'm walking away with $20,000 in profit. But the idea here is that what if I can make my property with these set expenses more desirable and worth more money on a nightly basis? What if I could add more value to it that people would be willing to pay more? Well, my expenses are not going to change just because the property is worth more, but my nightly rate goes up, right? And so what does that look like when you put it together? And so in scenario one, if you made $120,000 and your expenses are $100,000, you walk away with $20,000 in profit. Now, some people might be thinking like, hey, $20,000, that's awesome. Let's go buy another Airbnb and get it up and running and spend all that money and make another $20,000 in cash flow. Or what if you invested into amenities that made your place more desirable, that allowed you to increase your nightly rate, and now you go from making 120 to 140, and your expenses are pretty well staying the exact same, but now you've just doubled your profit, right? Your revenue goes up by 16%, your profit goes up by 100%, because your expenses don't really change. It's just your property has become more valuable. And so amenities are where you can get this like outsized return on the property that you already exist. Now, mind you, you're going to still have to go through that buy box criteria to figure out what the revenue drivers are within your market. Don't just throw a hot tub at your property and hope it works out, right? But the idea is like figure out what your revenue drivers are and try to invest strategically into those to be able to make your property worth more on a nightly basis, but also ensure that your market in general is willing to pay more for that property, okay? And I can talk about that in a second. But in a sense, let's say that you had a property without a hot tub, it's making $120,000. Then you add a hot tub, it makes an additional $10,000 a year. Your hot tub costs you $7,500, but you're making $10,000 more. Therefore, your return on that hot tub is roughly about 133%. I know there's more variables to that, such as the expenses from the hot tub and stuff like that. But I'm just using a quick analysis to kind of show you that investing into these amenities could be a really good return rather than going out and buying a whole other property again, right? And that's all I want to mention on amenities. So that's it, guys. That's everything.